In this video, we'll be discussing Confucianism, and if we have time, Buddhism. If not, we'll save Buddhism for a next video. Notice in the artwork interpretation you have in front of you, on the left you have Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, carrying the text of the I Ching back to civilization, riding on the back of an ox along a river's courseway. And on the right you have Confucius. Notice in the Confucian artwork a number of Taoist aesthetic principles. Remember, aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that deals with questions about art and beauty. Notice the balance between the human elements and nature. No one is dominating the other. Instead, both are in equal proportion, in relationship to each other, rather than domination. Compare this if you're familiar with one of the great paintings of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, in which he's inside, there's nothing natural around him, and the only non-human thing you see is a mink coat, a slaughtered animal, and Louis dominating the painting. Notice also you have the various elements, sky and clouds, mountains and life, and these clouds form flowing water over here, representing the Taoist principle Wu Wei, or actionless action, effortless effort, or going with the flow. In fact, there is no such person named Confucius. The person's name is Kong. Fuzi is a title like master, teacher, or you might know the Japanese sensei. The Analects of Confucius are the core text we'll be discussing, considered the central text of Confucian philosophy. And it expresses three primary virtues, the first of which is Ren, which translates to something like benevolence, humanity, or reciprocity. The symbol for Ren actually is somewhat easy to understand. On the left side, this is the symbol for a person. It's stylized in this case, but in its original form it looks like a man walking. And on the right side of the symbol, you see two lines parallel, one above the other. Here we are. This represents the number 2, so that symbolically the virtue of Ren is what happens anytime there are two or more people. There is an equalness of give and take. That's what reciprocity means. There's a mutual relationship. If you know what reciprocal fractions are in mathematics, they're fractions that are equal and opposite, such as 3/4 and 4/3. What's interesting about these fractions is that when you multiply them, it reduces to 1. It has a unity. There's a wholeness. This virtue also includes a sense of moderation of the desires, so that moderation is important here, as in Taoism, as in Buddhism, and as in the ancient Greek philosophy we'll be discussing very shortly. Also, we have a version of what's called the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is articulated in the Mosaic texts, what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call the Torah, as well as by Jesus, with the famous "do unto others as you would have them do unto you," and in the single most important Renaissance German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, and his philosophy. Therefore, the Golden Rule, or "do unto others as you would have them do unto you," is not unique to any one religion, but probably the single most well-known and widely dispersed ethical principle in human history. This raises questions again, such as, if a person does unto others as they would have them do unto them, does it matter which religion they consider themselves to be practicing it under? Does it only matter when it comes from one religious inspiration rather than another? Or is one as good as another? If they're the same, what difference does it make? That's a question I can't answer for you, but I would encourage you to wrestle with in order to make sense of the world, its cultures, and their ideas in the context of each other and history. The other virtues, li and yi. Li means something between ritual, culture, etiquette, prudence, morality, manners. It includes reverence to ancestors, living and dead, as well as social responsibility. Ultimately, the Analects of Confucius are a political text on how to be a good and virtuous leader, where the cultivation of moral virtue is better than rule by force. Confucius, along with Buddha, Socrates and Plato, and Jesus, are idealists. Their philosophy expresses an idealism. We'll define idealism when we discuss Plato. But for our purposes at this moment, we could simply point out the relationship between idealism and being idealistic, even to the point of being naive. If you don't know what the word naive means, take this opportunity to Google its definition. Confucius's idealism, or perhaps naivete, is that if a society's rulers and leaders are virtuous, the people will be virtuous because of their good example. Perhaps that is unrealistic and impractical. Or perhaps, as with the ethic of Jesus, it's something to strive for. An ideal that's valuable even if it's not perfectly achieved. Confucius's idea is that if the leadership of a political society is not virtuous, then the people will not be virtuous and will instead have to be ruled by force, rather than by good example. Ask for yourself whether our society's political leadership you consider to be the most morally virtuous people in our society. If not, as many people are fond of identifying, this might, to some at least small extent, explain the role of rule by force to the extent that it exists in our society or others. But of course, that's only if Confucius is on to anything. He might be missing the mark, which is what makes philosophical discussion fun and interesting. We can debate whether even a great such as Confucius, Plato, or Jesus is right or wrong about the ideas they present. I'll skip the first one and allow you to deal with it as you desire, and move on to the second one. The Master Kong, that is Confucius, says that learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous. Perilous means dangerous. To make sense of this dictum or saying, let's break it into halves. The first half says that learning without thought is labor lost, meaning a waste of time. As in, to merely memorize by rote dates, names, facts, or formula in math is a waste of time because you'll forget it. And so, if you take the time and effort to truly understand your subject, that will not be a waste of time. I'd encourage you to carry that advice with you as far as you can. The second half, that thought without learning is perilous, is perhaps slightly more challenging to make sense of. The idea that someone who is thoughtful but lacks what we might call an educational context could be dangerous. We can try to come up with examples of. In that spirit, I'll provide a specific and topical political example. Specifically, the idea that a 2,000-mile-long wall with the United States' southern neighbor, Mexico, will either improve our economy generally or solve our issues of the lack of immigration reform. is a thought, but it lacks context. Namely, that immigration is decreasing, but more importantly, that most illegal immigration happens from people overstaying their visas. So that an enormous wall is in danger of being a boondoggle or shibboleth. Not only would it be likely to be an enormous waste of money with little to no tangible benefit, ethically, morally, culturally, and politically, it's divisive by design. Perhaps in the 21st century, the United States of America can wall itself off from the rest of the world. But more likely, such an endeavor would be a fool's errand. Moreover, nationalism, racism, and xenophobia, in the context of political, social, and cultural history, are obscenely dangerous. Precisely because of their artificial divisiveness. I would encourage you to come up with your own examples, especially if you don't particularly agree with my argument as I've presented. Let's continue on for now, though. The master says, "Shall I teach you what knowledge is? When you know a thing, to hold that you know it. When you do not know a thing, to allow that you do not know it. This is knowledge." What he's attempting to express is the nature of humility, which Socrates, in the texts written by Plato, will similarly express. Pay close attention later when Plato writes of Socrates, that Socrates says, "I only know that I do not know," or "I have no wisdom, small or great." What Confucius and Socrates are concerned about is people who think they know more than they actually know. False knowledge, or pretenders to wisdom. We should have not only humility, but accuracy in terms of what we do know and what we are capable of knowing. For example, and this is an incredibly important example, in strict philosophical and epistemological terms. Remember what epistemology means: the study of knowledge, or how we know what we know. No one can know the mind of God, nor precisely God's will. Certainly not any certain knowledge of the afterlife, or even whether a God exists at all in the first place. You cannot know these things. You can believe that the will of God is one thing or another. You can believe in this God, that God, or those gods. Or have beliefs about the afterlife. But both Plato and Confucius are creating a hard and fast distinction between knowledge and belief, and that we should not be confused thinking we know more than we actually do or can. I'll leave you to continue pondering the implications of this, perhaps, Confucian wisdom. The superior person does not, even for the space of a single meal, act contrary to virtue. In moments of haste, he cleaves to it. In seasons of danger, he cleaves to it. Cleave in this context means to stick close. As we'll see momentarily, virtue for Confucius, to the greatest extent, refers to what in Hinduism we called ahimsa, or non-violence, non-harming. It's not when danger is all about and a person has to make split-second decisions that virtue goes out the window, that non-violence takes a back seat. Instead, that is precisely the time that virtue is important. It's when things are happening quickly. It's when situations are dangerous that doing the right thing matters. How we define what the right thing to do is differs according to the set of ethical ideals we subscribe to. Perhaps we have choice in determining which ethical system we would prefer to follow. Or perhaps one is ideal and the rest inferior. That too is a debate I can't possibly answer for you. I'll encourage you to keep that in mind throughout the semester. Going on, the person of perfect virtue, wishing to be established himself, seeks also to establish others, wishing to be enlarged himself, seeks also to enlarge others. This is that virtue of ren, or reciprocity, that we had discussed previously. And in fact, it's what we are doing right now, you and I. Whether you realize it or not, you are helping me further my career and pay my rent. And I'm helping you further your education, which will hopefully further your career, and graduate, which hopefully, for your sake, will result in more monetary compensation over your lifetime. This virtue of ren is a sort of you scratch my back, I scratch yours ethic. It's tit for tat. You help me, I help you. Or, as Jesus and Moses put it, do unto others. Halfway done with some highlights of the Analects of Confucius. Confucius says, when you have faults, do not fear to abandon them. Meaning that when you have some behavior or idea that is faulty, immoral, or wrong, let it go. Discard it. Don't keep bad ideas just because you've held them for a long time. Don't keep bad habits. Instead, simply abandon faults. It's simplistic, but I would ask you whether it expresses some wisdom. In my opinion and argument, it likely does, while it is difficult to enact. You see here, Chung Kung asked about perfect virtue. The master said, not to do to others as you would not wish done to yourself. I don't think it makes any difference if it's in the negative or the affirmative version, but I'll let you think through that one if you desire. The master said, when internal examination discovers nothing wrong, what is there to be anxious about? What is there to fear? Socrates is also interested in internal examination. His famous motto is that the unexamined life is not worth living. But here, Confucius is dealing in terms of fear and anxiety. When you look within your mind, within your heart, and within your soul, and you're comfortable and confident with what you find there, what would there be to fear? Even death. To the person at peace and content, there's nothing to be afraid of. And that's powerful. For the religious person, most often, death is nothing scary. It's merely a transition. Why would one need to fear death if it's a transition to a better life, and if you've lived your life well? Even more powerfully, why would one be willing to kill others to save yourself unless there were some significant fear or anxiety when one looks within oneself and perhaps discovers that everything is not as in place as it should or could be. The fear of death is a powerful motivator. In Hinduism, there's an ethical principle about not clinging so desperately to life with such fear that we would lose it, that it would cause us to engage in unethical actions. For Hinduism, violence. Jesus, as a sort of mystic, expresses something similar. Whoever loses his life will gain it. Whoever saves his life will lose it. It's noteworthy that Jesus, called the Christ, goes willingly to his own death. Does not hide from it, does not try to escape it, but confronts it and endures it with perfect grace. There's a debate between competing ethical and philosophical systems as to whether that type of perfect moral virtue is achievable. It's easy to say, but I'm not Jesus. And it's hard to live up to the demands of truly following in the footsteps of a moral paragon such as Jesus or Socrates, who in exactly the same way goes willingly to his own death, unwilling to compromise virtue in favor of expediency or mere survival, if survival means compromising one's cherished and ideal beliefs. Perhaps we're not meant to live up to their standard. Perhaps we can't. But if we abandon the morality that Socrates, Confucius, Buddha, or Jesus presents, I think it would be worthwhile to ask, what's even the point of having them in the first place then? Master Confucius says, by extensively studying all learning, and keeping himself under the restraint of the rules of propriety, one may thus likewise not err or go astray from what is right, which is what we're trying to do here. To study the history of ideas and their relationships as broadly as possible in order to determine what is true and what is just. And here Confucius is at his most radical and idealistic. He answers his students, "Sir, in carrying on your government, why should you use killing at all? Let your evinced desires, that is, the desires that show through, be for what is good, and the people will be good. Likely, Confucius is being naively idealistic. Governments will likely have to kill people. However, if we give the government and its agents acting on its and our behalves carte blanche, that's French for a blank check, to kill as they might want or desire with impunity, would that be moral? If there were some ability to reduce the necessity of killing by the government, both of foreign nationals and our own citizens, would that not be preferable? Even if we couldn't completely end killing on behalf of the government, wouldn't reduction be worthwhile to pursue? In the spirit of Socrates, I would encourage you not to be complacent or morally lazy. It's easy to say, kill them all. It's much more challenging to not. Confucius says, if a man take no thought about what is distant, he will find sorrow near at hand. I think this would be especially relevant for issues of climate change. If we do not pay attention to what's coming down the pike, it will affect us negatively sooner, even more than later. Confucius ends with this, that without knowing the force of words, it is impossible to know men. So, for us, we will investigate the force of words like kill, death, fear, war, God, the soul, religion, justice, goodness, truth, and beauty, in order to understand ourselves, each other, and how we all fit into the world we share together.